This little girl, only 6 years old, was forced by her father to get married. Everyone was shocked and angry at him. But on the wedding day at the altar, the father makes a revelation that immediately makes everyone there start crying. What do you think is going to happen? Tell us in the comments and subscribe to the channel to support my work. John Torres gazed at the sunset through the window of his 40th floor office. The last golden rays reflected off the glass, illuminating his face, etched with fatigue. At 45, he had achieved everything he'd dreamed of materially. His clothing company was one of the largest in the country, with stores across every state. The empire he built represented years of hard work and unwavering dedication. But at that moment, alone in his office, his thoughts weren't on numbers or contracts. They were at home, where his little Isabel Teresa, only 6 years old, was waiting for him. The girl was his greatest treasure, the light that had illuminated his days since his beloved wife Clara passed away during childbirth. Raising Isabel alone had been the greatest challenge of his life, but also his greatest joy. A gentle smile touched his lips as he thought of his daughter. Isabel was an extraordinary child, sweet, intelligent, and with a smile that could melt any heart. Even on the toughest days, when responsibilities felt overwhelming, all it took was seeing that angelic face to make everything worthwhile again. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Andrew Bloomfield, his business partner and childhood friend. "John, we need to talk about the new collection. The numbers aren't adding up, and Andrew, can we leave that for tomorrow? I promised." "Isabel, I'd be home early tonight," John interrupted, already starting to gather his belongings. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Sure. How's she doing?" "She's fine. Excited for the weekend. Luke is coming over to play." Andrew chuckled. "My son can't talk about anything else either. Those two are inseparable." The friendship between Isabel and Luke, Andrew's son, was one of the few constants in their busy lives. The children had grown up together, sharing games, laughter, and a bond that only childhood can provide. John said goodbye to his friend and went down to the garage where his driver was waiting for him. During the drive home, he watched the bustling city streets through the dark-tinted windows of the car. His mind, however, was restless. Something had been bothering him for days, a strange feeling he couldn't explain. Upon arriving home, he was greeted by the sound of Isabel's laughter echoing through the entryway. The girl ran towards him as soon as she saw him, her chestnut curls bouncing with each step. "Daddy!" she shouted, throwing herself into his arms. "You're home early!" John hugged her tightly, inhaling the delicate scent of her hair. "A promise is a promise, princess." The nanny, Mrs. Mercedes, approached with a tired smile. "She's been a little firecracker today, hasn't stopped for a minute. You can go rest, Mercedes. I'll take care of her now," he said, still holding his daughter. After the nanny left, John took Isabel to the backyard. The sun had already set, but the sky still held a deep blue hue, and the first stars were beginning to appear. They sat on the swing set he had installed when the girl turned 4. "How was your day, princess?" "It was great. The teacher taught us about butterflies, and I drew a picture. Do you want to see it?" While Isabel ran inside to get her drawing, John felt that unease return with full force. His vision blurred slightly for a moment, and a sudden wave of discomfort washed over him. He took a deep breath, trying to compose himself before his daughter came back. "Look, Daddy!" Isabel exclaimed, returning with a colorful sheet of paper in her hands. "It's a blue butterfly, just like the one we saw at the botanical gardens." John examined the drawing, praising every detail with genuine interest. The butterfly had huge, colorful wings decorated with small hearts. In the background, Isabel had drawn what appeared to be them too, holding hands. "It's you and me, Daddy," she explained, pointing to the figures. "And the butterfly is protecting us." Something in the innocence of those words made his heart clench. He pulled his daughter closer, hugging her tightly. "Daddy, are you okay?" she asked, noticing something different in his behavior. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just tired," he replied, forcing a smile. "How about we go make dinner?" The girl agreed excitedly, already forgetting her momentary worry. As he watched her run inside, John felt that strange sensation again, as if something important was about to change in their lives. The rest of the evening went by normally. They prepared mac and cheese, Isabel's favorite dish, while she told more stories about her day at school. After dinner, they watched a princess movie, with the girl nestled in his lap until she fell asleep. As he put her to bed, John spent a few minutes watching her peaceful sleep, her little hands held tightly to her favorite stuffed bunny, a gift from Clara that the girl treasured. On the nightstand, Clara's portrait smiled serenely, as if watching over her daughter's sleep. "She's just like you, Clara," he whispered to the photo. "She has the same smile, the same sweetness." Leaving his daughter's room, John went to his study. The house was silent except for the ticking of the antique clock on the wall. He sat in his favorite armchair, the one Clara had chosen when they moved into the mansion, and allowed the tears he had held back all day to finally fall. The unease that had been haunting him for days had intensified. His hands trembled slightly as he held the phone, dialing the number he had memorized earlier. On the other end of the line, a professional voice answered. "Dr. Richard Mendez office, good evening." "Good evening, this is John Torres. I'd like to make an appointment for tomorrow. It's urgent." Morning arrived with a thin fog covering the city. John had spent the night awake, watching Isabel's peaceful sleep. Each soft breath his daughter took was like a reminder of what was at stake. At 6 in the morning, he called Andrew to let him know he wouldn't be coming to the office. It was the first time in 15 years he had done that without an apparent reason. "Is everything all right, John?" Andrew asked, the concern evident in his voice. "You never miss work." "I just need to take care of some personal matters," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Can you handle the meeting with the investors?" "Sure, but are you sure you don't want to tell me what's going on?" John hesitated for a moment. Andrew was more than a business partner. He was his best friend since childhood. They had grown up together, shared dreams, built their empires side by side. It was Andrew who held him up when Clara passed away, who helped him in the first months. With Isabel, when he barely knew how to hold a baby. "We'll talk later," he finally said. "I need to take Isabel to school now." The lie came too easily from his lips. Isabel was still asleep, and he had already asked Mrs. Mercedes to take her to school. He didn't want his daughter to notice his anxiety. Dr. Richard Mendez's office was located in the most prestigious medical center in the city. The waiting room, decorated in neutral tones and modern furniture, was practically empty at that time of the morning. Soft music played in the background, trying to create a peaceful atmosphere that contrasted brutally with John's inner turmoil. "Mr. Torres," the secretary called. "The doctor will see you now." Dr. Richard was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a paternal air that would normally inspire confidence. But that morning, his expression was grave. "The results of your tests are in, John," he began, adjusting his glasses as he looked at the computer screen. "We need to talk." What followed was a succession of medical terms that seemed to come from far away. John heard the words, tumor, metastasis, probabilities, but his brain refused to process them completely. His mind wandered to Isabel, to her innocent smile, to the promise he had made to Clara to always protect his little girl. "How long?" he interrupted, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. The doctor hesitated, interlacing his fingers on the desk. "With proper treatment, we can try to prolong it, but realistically, 6 months, maybe a little more." 6 months, the time it took to develop a new clothing collection, The time between one season and another. The time until Isabel's birthday. There are some treatment options we can consider, the doctor continued, his professional voice masking his compassion. Chemotherapy, radiation. What's the chance of a cure? John cut in. Another silence. At this stage, very low, but we can try to prolong. How much? Maybe a few months more. John stood up abruptly. His legs felt like lead, but he managed to stand firm. I need to think, he said simply, heading for the door. Mr. Torres, the doctor called. Don't wait. Too long. The sooner we start. He nodded without turning around and left the office. In the elevator, he pressed the ground floor button automatically. His mind was elsewhere, years ago, on the day Clara told him the news of her pregnancy. He remembered perfectly the happiness he felt, the plans they made, the dreams they shared. He never imagined he would have to raise Isabel alone, and now... His cell phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a message from Mrs. Mercedes with a picture of Isabel at school, smiling next to Luke. The children had worked together on an art project, a colorful poster about friendship. His daughter's smile, so pure and carefree, made his heart clench. Instead of going home, he drove to the cemetery where Clara was buried. He hadn't been there in months. The visits always left him emotionally exhausted. But at that moment, he needed to be near her, even if it was only symbolically. The gravesite was well maintained, with fresh flowers that the gardener changed weekly. He sat on the marble bench beside it, letting the tears flow freely for the first time since he started experiencing the symptoms. What do I do, Clara? He whispered to the wind. How do I protect our girl now? The silence of the cemetery was his only answer. He stayed there for hours, lost in thoughts and memories, until his cell phone rang again. It was Andrew. Where are you? I'm worried. I stopped by your house and Mrs. Mercedes said you left early and haven't come back. I'm fine, Andrew, he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. I just needed some time alone. John, we've been friends for over 30 years. Do you really think I don't notice when something's wrong? The genuine concern in his friend's voice almost broke his resolve to keep it a secret. Almost. I'm going to pick up Isabel from school, he said, avoiding the subject. We'll talk later. On the way to school, he stopped at a toy store. He bought several gifts for Isabel, dolls, games, coloring books. The clerk looked curiously at the number of packages, but didn't say anything. When he arrived at school, Isabel ran towards him as she always did, but something in his expression made her stop. Daddy, were you crying? She asked, touching his face with her little hands. No, princess, he lied, forcing a smile. It's just allergies. Look what I brought you. Her eyes lit up when she saw the presents, but the worry didn't completely leave her little face. It was amazing how perceptive children could be sometimes. Why so many presents, Daddy? It's not my birthday. Can't I spoil my princess? He replied, hugging her tightly. On the way home, Isabel chattered about her day at school, about the project she had done with Luke, about how the teacher had praised her drawing. John listened to every word with extra attention, recording every inflection in her voice, every laugh, every expression. At home, after Isabel went to sleep, he locked himself in his study again. He took out a sheet of paper and started doing calculations. His fortune was considerable. He had built an empire from scratch, after all. But now, looking at the numbers, it all seemed insignificant. What good was all that money if he couldn't buy more time? The phone rang again. It was Andrew, once more. John, I'm not hanging up until you tell me what's going on. I saw how strange you were with Isabel today at school pickup. I saw the presents. What's happening? He sighed deeply. Maybe it was time to share the weight he was carrying. After all, if something happened to him, Andrew would be one of the people who would help take care of Isabel. Can you come over? To my house early tomorrow morning, before the kids go to school? Sure, Andrew replied, the concern still evident in his voice. What time? 6 o'clock. And Andrew, come prepared for a difficult conversation. After hanging up, John went to Isabel's room. The girl was sleeping peacefully, hugging her. Stuffed bunny. He sat on the edge of the bed and watched her soft, regular breathing. How would he tell her? How would he explain to a 6-year-old that her father, her only safe haven, was? He couldn't complete the thought. Instead, he took one of her favorite books from the shelf and began to read it in a low voice, even knowing she couldn't hear him. It was a story about a princess who saved an entire kingdom with her kindness and courage. Isabel always said she wanted to be like that princess when she grew up. You're already braver than any princess, my love, he whispered, kissing her forehead. And you're going to need to be even braver soon. The clock hadn't even struck 6 when Andrew arrived. At the Torres mansion, the morning fog covered the garden like a thick blanket, giving the property an almost unreal air. John was already waiting for him in the study, the deep, dark circles under his eyes betraying another sleepless night. Coffee? John offered, indicating the tray that Mrs. Mercedes had left on the side table. Andrew accepted in silence, studying his friend with concern. He knew every expression on that face for more than 3 decades, every subtle change that indicated when something was wrong. And that morning, everything was wrong. You're scaring me, John, he finally said, after a few minutes of tense silence. What's going on? John got up from his armchair and walked to the window. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange. Outside, the gardener was already starting his daily work, as if it were a normal day. As if the world wasn't about to crumble. Remember when we were kids? He began, his voice low and controlled. When we dreamed of conquering the world? Andrew nodded, confused by the change of subject. Sure. You always said you were going to have the biggest clothing company in the country. And we did, didn't we? Everything we dreamed of. Everything we planned. John, Andrew interrupted, placing his mug on the table more forcefully than necessary. Stop beating around the bush. What's going on? John turned to face his friend. His hands trembled slightly as he took an envelope from his suit pocket and handed it to Andrew. Inside was the medical report, with all the tests and diagnoses. The silence that followed was deafening. Andrew read and reread the papers, his face growing paler with each passing moment. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with tears. No, he murmured, shaking his head. There must be a mistake. We'll find other doctors, do more tests. I already have, John cut in. 3 different opinions, every test possible. The result is always the same. How long? 6 months, maybe a little longer with treatment, but John swallowed hard, trying to control his emotion. The type of tumor is very aggressive. It's already spread. Andrew stood up abruptly, knocking over his coffee mug. The dark liquid stained the Persian rug, but neither of them seemed to notice. What about Isabel? Have you told her yet? How? John's voice faltered. How do I tell a 6-year-old that her father is going to... He couldn't finish the sentence. Andrew crossed the room in 3 strides and hugged his friend tightly. It was the first time he had seen John cry since Clara's funeral. You're not alone in this, Andrew said, his own voice choked with emotion. We'll face this together. We'll find a way. From outside the study, they heard the sound of small footsteps and laughter. Isabel was awake, probably looking for her father. The 2 men quickly separated, wiping their eyes. Uncle Andrew, Isabel exclaimed as she opened the door, running to hug him. Did you come to have coffee with us? I did, Princess, he replied, forcing a smile as he picked her up. And Luke's here too. He's downstairs with Mrs. Mercedes. Isabel's eyes lit up. I'll go get him to play in the yard. As soon as the girl left, Andrew turned to John. What are you going to do? I don't know yet, John admitted, running his hands over his tired face. But I need to get everything organized. The company, the assets, Isabel's future. Stop, Andrew cut in. First, we're going to focus on treatment. There must be something we can try, some new research, some specialist. Andrew, John interrupted, his voice firm despite the obvious pain. I need you to promise me something. If something happens to me... I'm not going to promise anything because nothing's going to happen, Andrew insisted. We're going to... We'll fight this. Please, John insisted. I need to know that Isabel will have someone, that she won't be alone. Andrew sat down again, defeated. You don't even need to ask. Isabel is like a niece to me. Luke adores her. She'll always have a family with us. From the garden, the children's laughter drifted in. John walked over to the window and watched Isabel and Luke playing tag among the rose bushes. She was wearing the blue dress that Clara had chosen before she passed, carefully preserved all these years for when her daughter grew up. Sometimes, he said, almost to himself, when I look at her, I see so much of Clara. The same smile, the same way she tilts her head when she's curious about something. She has a lot of you, too, Andrew commented, joining his friend at the window. The same determination, the same strength. She's going to need that strength, John murmured. More than ever. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. Andrew insisted on taking the children to school, giving John some time to compose himself. When he returned, he found his friend in his study, surrounded by papers and documents. What's all this? I'm getting everything organized, John replied without looking up. Will, powers of attorney, instructions for the company. John, please, Andrew pleaded. Let's focus on treatment first. You haven't even started fighting yet. Finally, John looked up from the documents. There was something different in his gaze, a mixture of determination and something else. I have an idea, he said slowly, but you're going to think I've gone crazy. Andrew sat down, bracing himself for what was to come. After 30 years of friendship, nothing you do surprises me anymore. I want to organize a wedding, John said. What? A wedding? For Isabel. Andrew jumped up. Now I'm sure you've lost it. She's 6 years old, John. Not a real wedding, John explained quickly. Just a symbolic ceremony. Something for her to keep as a memory, to have this moment with me. People aren't going to understand, Andrew warned. They'll think you've gone crazy. I don't care what they think, John replied, his voice gaining strength. I want to create a special memory with my daughter while I still can. I want her to have something to remember, something more than hospitals and sadness. Andrew watched his friend for a long moment. He recognized that look. It was the same one John had when he decided to open his first store, even though everyone said it was crazy. The same look he had when he decided to expand the company across the country, even during the recession. What do you need from me? He finally asked. A small smile appeared on John's lips. Your help, organizing everything. And could Luke participate? It would be important for Isabel to have her best friend by her side. Andrew sighed deeply. You know this is going to cause a scandal, don't you? The press is going to have a field day. Let them talk, John replied. What matters is that Isabel has this moment, that she knows that even when I'm not here anymore, her father did something special for her. The news of the symbolic wedding spread like wildfire. First, it was the whispers among the staff at the mansion. Then, the rumors reached the corridors of the company. Within days, the story had leaked to the local press, and soon the major newspapers in the country were running sensational headlines about the millionaire forcing his 6-year-old daughter to marry. John watched the pile of newspapers on his desk, all with variations of the same distorted story. Some painted him as a monster, others speculated about his sanity. Social media was buzzing with outraged comments, and his email inbox was flooded with hateful messages. This is out of control, Andrew said, walking into the office with yet another newspaper in his hand. "I just got 3 calls from investors worried about the company's image." John remained silent, his eyes fixed on the photo of Isabel on his desk. The girl didn't know anything yet. He had planned to tell her everything calmly, explain the special meaning of the ceremony. Now he feared she would find out in the worst possible way. "Maybe we should postpone it," Andrew suggested cautiously. "Wait for this storm to pass." "I don't have time to wait," John cut in, his voice harsher than he intended. He immediately regretted it when he saw the hurt expression on his friend's face. "Sorry, Andrew, it's just every day counts now." The silence that followed was interrupted by Mrs. Mercedes, who rushed into the office. "Mr. Torres, there are reporters at the door, a lot of them. They're scaring the children." John jumped up. "Where's Isabel?" "In her room, with Luke. I managed to bring them in through the back entrance when they got back from school, but they saw the photographers. They're scared." Without waiting for further explanation, John ran up the stairs, Andrew on his heels. They found the children sitting on the floor of the room, a storybook open between them, but it was clear they weren't paying attention to the reading. "Daddy," Isabel called as soon as she saw him, her voice small and scared. "Why are there so many people outside? They were shouting things." John's heart clenched. He sat down on the floor beside her, pulling her into his lap. Luke moved closer too, instinctively seeking the protection of the adults. "They're just curious people, Princess," he tried to explain, keeping his voice calm. "You don't need to be afraid." "But they seemed angry," Luke insisted, his big eyes fixed on Andrew. "I heard a man say that Uncle John is bad." The boy's words fell like stones in the room. John felt Isabel stiffen in his arms. "You're not bad, Daddy," she said with conviction, turning to face him. "Why are they saying that?" John exchanged a look with Andrew, who nodded slightly. It was time. "Isabel, Princess, I need to tell you something very special," he began, settling her more comfortably in his lap. "You know how the princesses in your books have magical parties?" Her eyes lit up with interest, momentarily forgetting her fear. "Like balls?" "That's right. I was thinking about throwing a party like that for you. A very special party, like a princess's wedding." "A wedding?" she asked, tilting her head in the way that so reminded him of Clara. "Yes, but not a real wedding. It would be like a game, a celebration of our love as father and daughter. And Luke could participate too as your best friend." Luke, who had moved closer, smiled shyly. "I can, Dad?" Andrew sat down next to his son, ruffling his hair affectionately. "Of course you can, champ. But why are people mad about it?" Isabel asked, the worry returning to her voice. John took a deep breath. "Sometimes, Princess, people don't understand things correctly. They think it's a real wedding, but it's not. It's just a special way of showing how much I love you." "Like when Mum used to have tea parties with us?" she asked, referring to the memories John had shared about Clara. "Exactly like that," he replied, fighting against the tears that threatened to fall. "A magical moment, just for us." Outside, they could hear the growing noise of the reporters. Occasional flashes illuminated the windows, even with the curtains closed. But inside the room, in that small circle formed by father, daughter, and their best friends, there was a bubble of understanding and love that no external judgment could penetrate. "I want to, Daddy," Isabel said finally, a smile lighting up her face. "I want to have a special party with you." Luke, taking his cue from his friend, added enthusiastically, "Can we wear fancy clothes, like in the fairy tales?" "You can," Andrew replied, visibly relieved by the children's positive reaction. "We're going to make something very beautiful." John hugged Isabel tightly, inhaling the soft scent of her hair. For a moment, he could almost feel Clara's presence there, blessing that moment. "Mr. Torres," Mrs. Mercedes called from the door, hesitant to interrupt the scene. "The police have arrived. They say they need to disperse the reporters before the situation gets out of control." The noise outside had increased considerably. Shouts and slogans could be heard clearly now. "Andrew," John called, "can you stay with the kids while I deal with this?" "Of course," replied his friend, already organizing the little ones for a story time session. "Let's read that new book you got, Isabel." John went down the stairs feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. At the gate of the mansion, a police officer was trying to maintain order among dozens of reporters and some protesters who had joined the crowd. "Mr. Torres," the officer called as soon as he saw him, "we need an official statement. The situation is escalating." John looked at the crowd through the iron gate. Hostile faces, cameras pointed, microphones extended like spears. For a moment, he felt a wave of despair. How would he protect Isabel from all of this? But then he remembered her smile as she accepted the idea of the party, the purity with which she understood the true meaning of that celebration. He wouldn't allow the wickedness of the world to tarnish something so special. "I'll talk to them," he said to the officer, adjusting his suit. "But first, I need to make a call." He returned to his study and dialed his lawyer's number. It was time to take more drastic measures to protect his family. The days that followed were a living hell. The Torres mansion, once a haven of peace for Isabel, had become a besieged fortress. Journalists camped out day and night in front of the gates, and social media offered no respite. Even with all the security measures implemented, the pressure was constant and suffocating. John watched the activity through the security cameras installed around the property, feeling increasingly exhausted. The stress of the last few days had considerably worsened his health. The pain, which had previously been sporadic, was now a constant companion, although he tried his best not to show it in front of Isabel. "You need to rest," Mrs. Mercedes insisted, entering the study with a tea tray. "You barely touched your breakfast today." "How's Isabel?" he asked, ignoring the housekeeper's concern. "She's in the backyard with Luke. Andrew brought him over earlier to distract her. The children are trying to build a treehouse." John allowed himself a small smile. Even amidst the chaos, his daughter could still find moments of joy. It was amazing how children had this ability to create their own world, oblivious to the storms that surrounded them. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Dr. Richard Mendez. "Mr. Torres, we need to talk about your latest tests." The doctor's voice sounded more grave than usual. "The results aren't good." John felt a pang in his chest. "How much time do I have left?" "If we don't start treatment immediately, less than we had predicted. The progression is faster than we expected. And with treatment, we can try to gain a few more weeks, maybe a month or two. But I need to be honest. It will be an aggressive process. You will be very debilitated." John looked at the calendar on his desk. The date of the ceremony was marked for 3 weeks. "From now. Can I wait until after the party?" "Mr. Torres," the doctor's voice took on a tone of urgency, "every day we wait decreases your chances." "Doctor," John interrupted, his voice firm despite the pain he felt. "I need this moment with my daughter. I need to be strong enough to dance with her, to see her smile. After that, I'll do whatever treatment you recommend." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "All right," the doctor finally conceded. "But I want to see you twice. A week until then, to monitor your condition. And at the first sign of significant worsening, we'll have to intervene." As soon as he hung up, John went to the window. From his vantage point, he could see Isabel and Luke playing in the yard. Andrew was supervising the construction of the treehouse, passing tools to the children and making sure everything was done safely. "You shouldn't sacrifice your health like this," Mrs. Mercedes said, who had remained silent during the call. The girl needs her father alive. Mercedes, he replied without taking his eyes off the scene in the yard. When Clara died, I promised her I would give Isabel all the happy memories I could. I can't leave without fulfilling that promise. The housekeeper sighed but didn't argue. She knew that tone of voice. It was the same one John used when he made an irrevocable decision. The sound of children's laughter filled the study when Andrew opened the back door, bringing the children inside. They were covered in dirt and their faces were flushed from playing. "Daddy! Daddy!" Isabel exclaimed, running towards him. "We built a tree house. Do you want to see it?" John felt a sharp pain in his chest as he bent down to hug her, but he kept the smile on his face. "Of course I do, Princess. Show Daddy what you built." "Uncle Andrew said we can decorate it with lights when it's finished," added Luke, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. "It's going to be like a castle perfect for a princess," agreed John, exchanging a meaningful look with Andrew. His friend immediately realized that something was wrong. "Kids, how about you go clean up a bit? Mrs. Mercedes can help you take a bath before lunch." As soon as they were alone, Andrew closed the study door. "What did the doctor say?" John collapsed into his armchair, finally allowing himself to show the tiredness and pain he felt. "It's getting worse, Andrew, faster than they expected." "My God, John!" Andrew ran his hands over his face, trying to process the information. "What about the ceremony? Maybe we should—" "No," John cut in. "The party is going to happen. It's the only thing that matters now." "But your health—" "Andrew," he interrupted again, his voice breaking slightly. "Don't you understand? I need to create this memory for her. Something she can keep, something special to remember her father by besides hospitals and suffering." Andrew sat down heavily in the chair across from his friend's desk. "And after? Have you thought about after?" "I haven't thought about anything else," John admitted. "The papers are all organized. You and your wife will have shared custody with Clara's family. The company will be managed by a board until Isabel is old enough to take over if she wants to." "Stop!" Andrew pleaded, his voice choked with emotion. "I don't want to hear about wills and custody. I want you to fight, to get treatment." A coughing fit interrupted the conversation. When John removed the handkerchief from his mouth, there were blood stains on the white fabric. Andrew jumped up, but his friend gestured for him to stay where he was. "Don't tell Isabel," he asked, as soon as he could catch his breath. "I don't want her to see her father like this." "John, for God's sake. Promise me, Andrew. Promise. You'll help me keep up this charade for 3 more weeks. Then you can drag me to whatever hospital you want." Before Andrew could answer, they heard a knock on the door. It was Isabel, already clean and changed, carrying a drawing in her hands. "Daddy, look what I made. It's my dress for the party." John quickly put the stained handkerchief in his pocket and forced a smile. "Let me see, Princess." The drawing showed a small figure in a blue dress full of stars. Next to it, there was another larger figure clearly representing John, wearing a suit. "It's beautiful, my love," he said, pulling her into his lap. "It's going to be the most beautiful dress that ever existed." "More beautiful than Mom's?" she asked, referring to Clara's wedding dress, which was stored in a special box in the attic. "Different," he replied, kissing the top of her head. "Every special moment has its own sparkle." Andrew watched the scene with a heavy heart. John's determination to create this last magical moment for his daughter was as strong as his own physical deterioration. "Uncle Andrew," Isabel called, "do you think Mom will be able to see it from heaven?" The innocent question hit both men like a punch to the gut. Andrew swallowed hard before answering, "I'm sure she will, Princess. Your mom would never miss such a special moment." John hugged Isabel tighter, ignoring the pain the movement caused. In his mind, he said a silent prayer, asking for strength to endure until the big day. He couldn't falter now, not when he was so close to fulfilling his last wish. The Torres mansion had turned into a construction site in recent days. Decorators came and went, transforming the garden into a fairy tale setting. White and blue flowers covered every available surface, and small lights were installed among the trees, creating a magical ambiance even during the day. John watched all the activity from his armchair in the study, where he had been practically confined by Andrew and Mrs. Mercedes. His health worsened with each passing day, although he tried his best to hide it from Isabel. "You need to eat," Mrs. Mercedes insisted, placing a tray with soup on the table next to his armchair. "You haven't touched your breakfast again." "I can't," he admitted, his voice weaker than usual. "The smell of food makes me nauseous." The housekeeper exchanged a worried look with Andrew, who had just entered the study carrying more papers. "Dr. Richard called 3 times today," Andrew said, his voice betraying his concern. "He insists you need to go to the hospital." "No," John replied firmly, although the effort to speak was visible. "There are only 10 days left until the ceremony. I'll hold on." As if to contradict his words, a coughing fit overtook him. Andrew quickly grabbed a clean handkerchief and handed it to his friend, trying not to show his horror at seeing the bloodstains that stained it. "Daddy!" Isabel's voice sounded from the door, causing all 3 adults to freeze. John quickly hid the handkerchief and forced a smile. "Come in, Princess." Isabel entered the study, carrying a small bouquet of flowers she had picked from the garden. She was wearing one of the new dresses they had bought for the ceremony rehearsals, and her hair was styled in an elaborate braid. "I brought you flowers," she said, placing the makeshift bouquet and a glass of water on the table. "The lady from the caterer said they're the same ones they're going to use at the party." "They're beautiful, my love," he replied, reaching out to hug her. Isabel snuggled into her father's lap, but something in her little face showed concern. "Are you sick, Daddy?" John's heart skipped a beat. "It's just a cold, Princess. It'll pass soon." "Promise?" The innocence of that question was like a dagger to the hearts of all the adults present. Andrew had to turn his face away to hide the tears that were beginning to form. "I promise I'll be well for our special party," John replied, kissing the top of his daughter's head. It wasn't exactly a lie. He would do anything to be well on that day. "Luke's downstairs," Isabel said, changing the subject as only children can do. "He brought his new suit to show you. Do you want to see?" "Of course I do. Why don't you go get him?" As soon as Isabel skipped out of the study, John let his mask of strength fall. He leaned forward, breathing with difficulty. "For God's sake, John," Andrew pleaded, "let's go to the hospital. We can have the party later." "There won't be a later," John cut in, his voice so low that the others could barely hear him. "You know that as well as I do." The silence that followed was interrupted by children's voices approaching. Luke entered first, all proud in his little navy blue suit, followed by Isabel, who wouldn't stop chattering about how they looked like a prince and a princess. "You look very elegant, Luke," John praised, making a visible effort to straighten. Up in his armchair. "My dad said I can wear the same bow tie as him," replied the boy, beaming. "And I'm going to wear Mom's veil," added Isabel. "Mrs. Mercedes is adjusting it for me." The mention of Clara's veil reminded John of something. "Mercedes," he called, "can you get that special box from my room, the one at the back of the closet?" The housekeeper nodded and left, returning minutes later with a dark blue velvet box. John took it carefully, as if holding something too precious to be real. "Come here, Princess," he called. When Isabel approached, he opened the box, revealing a delicate crystal tiara. "It belonged to your mom. She wore it on our wedding day." Isabel's eyes widened at the sight of the jewel. "It's so beautiful. She wanted you to wear it someday," John continued, his voice choked with emotion. "I've kept it all these years, waiting for the right moment." With trembling hands, he removed the tiara from the box. and carefully placed it on Isabel's head. The contrast of the crystals against her dark hair was stunning. For a moment, it was as if Clara was there, smiling through her daughter's eyes. "Now you truly are a princess," he said, fighting back tears. Luke, who had been watching everything in silence, approached his friend. "You look very pretty, Isabel," he said with the sincerity that only children possess. Andrew watched the scene with a broken heart. Seeing his best friend struggling to create this last special moment with his daughter, even when each breath seemed to cost him immense effort, was one of the most painful things he had ever witnessed. "Kids," he called, realizing that John needed a moment to compose himself. "How about we go see how the garden decorations are coming along?" After the children left, Mrs. Mercedes approached John with a glass of water and his pain medication. "You need to rest," she insisted. "You're getting paler and paler." John took the medication without protesting, a sign of how much he was really suffering, since he normally resisted any kind of medication. "Mercedes," he called after a moment, "I need you to promise me something. Anything you want. If I don't make it..." He hesitated, taking a deep breath before continuing. "If I don't make it to the day of the party, promise you'll hold the ceremony anyway. Isabel deserves to have that special moment." The housekeeper felt tears streaming down her face. "You're going to make it. You have to make it." "Promise," he insisted. "I promise," she finally replied, her voice broken by emotion. "But you also need to promise that you'll fight with all your strength to be there." John nodded slightly, closing his eyes. The effort of staying conscious and present during the children's visit had completely exhausted him. From the garden came the animated voices of Isabel and Luke, mixed with the sound of the workers who continued the preparations. For the party, life went on, even when it seemed like the world was falling apart for those who knew the truth. There were only 5 days left until the ceremony, when John had his worst crisis yet. It was dawn when Mrs. Mercedes heard the screams coming from his room. She found him lying next to the bed, coughing up blood and barely able to breathe. "Please," he begged between coughing fits, "don't call an ambulance. Isabel can't know." But this time the housekeeper didn't give in. In minutes, Andrew was there, helping to carry his friend to the car, while a sleepy Mrs. Mercedes made up a story for Isabel about an urgent business trip. "Daddy didn't even say goodbye," complained the girl, her big eyes filled with worry. "He had to leave very early, dear," Mercedes lied, feeling her heart clench, "but he'll be back soon in time for the party." At the hospital, the doctors didn't hide their concern. Dr. Richard examined John with a grave expression that Andrew knew all too well. "We need to start treatment immediately," the doctor declared. "There's no more time to lose." "How much?" asked John, his voice almost inaudible. "How long will the treatment keep me in the hospital?" "At least 2 weeks, and even then..." "No," John cut in, trying to sit up despite the pain. "The party is in 5 days. I can't miss it." "Mr. Torres," the doctor adjusted his glasses, clearly uncomfortable. "I need to be frank. Without immediate treatment, you may not make it to the party." Andrew, who had been watching everything in silence, finally interjected. "What if we start the treatment now and take a break on the day of the party?" The doctor shook his head. "It would be extremely risky. The treatment will weaken him a lot. Participating in a social event under those conditions..." "It's not just a social event," John interrupted, a coughing fit punctuating his words. "It's the last chance to create a happy memory with my daughter." The silence that followed was heavy. Dr. Richard looked from John to Andrew, then back at his test results. "I can try a lighter treatment in the first few days," he said finally, "something that allows you to maintain some strength. But I need you to understand the risks, your chances of..." "I don't care about the chances," John cut in. "I just need to be there for her. I just need to dance with my daughter one last time." Meanwhile, at the mansion, Isabel woke up early, eager to show her father the latest alterations to her dress. When Mrs. Mercedes explained again that he was traveling, her eyes filled with tears. "But what if he doesn't come back in time for the party?" "He'll be back, honey," Mercedes promised, praying silently that her words were true. "Your dad would never miss such a special moment." Luke, who had been brought over to keep his friend company, tried to cheer her up. "We can finish the treehouse while we wait. Then when your dad gets back, we'll show him how pretty it looks." The distraction worked partially. The children spent the morning in the yard, supervised by Mercedes, while the preparations for the party continued around them. The setting was almost complete. A true fairy tale was taking shape among the ancient trees. At the hospital, John fought against the pain and weakness. The treatment, even in its mildest form, left him nauseous and confused. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Isabel's face, her innocent smile, her anticipation for the party. "I need to make a call," he asked Andrew, who hadn't left his side since his admission. "John, you need to rest." "Please, Andrew, I need to hear her voice." Reluctantly, Andrew dialed the mansion's number. After a few rings, Isabel's animated voice sounded on the speakerphone. "Hello?" "Hi, Princess," John managed to say, making a huge effort to make his voice sound normal. "Daddy, where are you? I miss you." "I miss you too, sweetheart. How are the preparations for the party going?" "It's all so beautiful. There are flowers everywhere and lights and—" As Isabel excitedly described every detail, John closed his eyes, letting his daughter's voice envelop him like a warm blanket. Andrew watched, feeling his heart break as he saw the silent tears streaming down his friend's face. "You're coming back soon, right?" she asked finally. "You promise you won't miss the party?" "I promise, Princess," he replied, his voice faltering slightly. "Nothing in the world would make me miss this moment with you." After the call, John seemed even more determined. He followed all the doctor's instructions to the letter, took all the medications without complaining, did all the necessary procedures. "I've never seen so much willpower," commented one of the nurses to Andrew. "It's like he's holding on by sheer determination." "He is," Andrew replied simply. "A father's love is capable of miracles." The days passed slowly. Each morning, Dr. Richard did new tests, always with the same worried expression. Each afternoon, Andrew brought news of the preparations, photos of the progress of the decoration, messages from Isabel. On the eve of the ceremony, John had a serious conversation with the doctor. "I want all the pain medication you can give me," he said. "Anything that will keep me on my feet during the party." "Mr. Torres," the doctor began, "I need to warn you that even with all the medication, your body is extremely debilitated. Participating in a social event under these conditions—" "Doctor," John interrupted, his voice firmer than it had been. "In days, tomorrow is the most important day of my life. It's my last chance to give my daughter a happy memory with her father. I don't care what happens afterward, I just need to be there for her." The doctor looked at his patient for a long time, then at the tests in his hands. Finally, he nodded slightly. "I will prescribe the maximum medication that your body can handle, but I want an ambulance on standby throughout the event. As long as it stays discreet, out of the children's sight," John agreed. That night, as Andrew helped him prepare to leave the hospital, John asked for a moment alone. He took out of his bathrobe pocket an envelope he had written during his waking hours. "In the hospital. If something happens to me tomorrow," he said, handing the envelope to his friend, "give this to Isabel when she's older. It's everything I didn't have a chance to say, everything I want her to know." Andrew took the envelope with trembling hands. "Nothing's going to happen tomorrow," he said, but his voice betrayed his own uncertainty. "Promise you'll take care of her, Andrew, that you'll love her as if she were your own." "You know I will. I always have, I always will. When they finally left the hospital, night had already fallen. On the horizon, the first signs of dawn began to appear. The long-awaited day had finally arrived. "Ready?" asked Andrew, helping his friend into the car. John looked at the sky that was beginning to clear, then at the photo of Isabel he always kept with him. "Ready to give my princess the most special day of her life." The day dawned like something out of a fairy tale. The garden of the Torres mansion had been transformed into a magical setting. White and blue flowers covered every surface, delicate. Lights hung between the trees, and a small altar had been set up under the ancient oak where Isabel and Luke used to play. John watched the final preparations through the window of his room, where Andrew and Dr. Richard were helping him get ready. His hands were shaking so much that he could barely button his shirt. "Let me do that," Andrew said, stepping in to help his friend. "You need to save your strength." Dr. Richard checked John's vital signs for the third time that morning, his face a mask of professional concern. "Blood pressure's still low," he murmured, more to himself than to the others. "I'm going to increase the dosage of the medication." "I don't want to be drowsy," John protested. "I need to be present. I need to—" A violent coughing fit interrupted him. Andrew quickly held a handkerchief to his mouth while the doctor helped him sit down. "If this continues, I'm going to have to cancel everything," Dr. Richard threatened. "No!" The force in John's voice surprised everyone. "I'm not giving up now. Not when we're so close." From downstairs came the animated sounds of the preparations. Isabel's voice could be heard occasionally, her excitement evident even from a distance. "She's so happy," John said, a faint smile lighting up his pale face. "So innocent." "John," Andrew called softly, "are you sure you want to do this? We can postpone it, wait for you to get stronger." "There won't be another day," he replied, his voice low but firm. "You know that as well as I do." The silence that followed was interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Mrs. Mercedes, bringing another dose of medication. "The girl is almost ready," she informed him, trying to keep her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to fall. "She's beautiful as an angel." "She's always been an angel," murmured John, accepting the pills with trembling hands, "just like her mother." Meanwhile, in Isabel's room, a small army of women was dedicated to preparing the girl. The light blue dress, sprinkled with small crystals, made her eyes shine even brighter. The tiara that had belonged to Clara rested perfectly among her dark curls. "Do I look like a real princess?" she asked for the 10th time, twirling in front of the mirror. "The most beautiful princess that ever existed," replied the makeup artist, putting the finishing touches on her face. Not that Isabel needed makeup. Her natural beauty and innocence were her greatest charm. Luke, already ready in his little suit, waited in the hallway with his father. The boy was restless, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Dad," he called in a low voice, "why does Uncle John look so different?" Andrew felt his heart clench. Children were much more perceptive than adults like to admit. "He's a little tired, son. He's been working too hard lately." Luke didn't seem very convinced, but before he could ask more questions, the door to Isabel's room opened. The collective gasp that followed was involuntary. Isabel seemed to have stepped directly from the pages of a storybook. The dress floated around her like a cloud of dreams, and her mother's tiara shone like stars in her hair. "You look beautiful," exclaimed Luke, his face turning slightly red afterward. Isabel smiled, a smile so radiant that it lit up the entire hallway. "Where's Daddy? I want to show him." The adults exchanged worried glances. Andrew stepped forward. "Your dad is finishing getting ready, Princess. He'll be here to see you soon." In John's room, Dr. Richard administered another dose of medication directly into his vein. "This should help with the pain," he explained. "But I can't give you any more without risking you fainting." "How long will it last?" asked John, already feeling the characteristic tingling of the medicine spreading through his body. 2 hours, at most. "It's enough," he said, trying to get up. His legs wavered for a moment, but he stood firm. "It's all I need." Andrew entered the room at that moment, his eyes shining with contained emotion. "She's ready," he announced. "And my God, John, she looks just like Clara." The words hit John like a punch to the stomach. For a moment, his mask of strength fell, and thick tears streamed down his face. "I need a minute," he asked, his voice choked with emotion. When he was alone, he took out of his pocket an old photo, him and Clara on their wedding day. She was wearing the same tiara that now adorned Isabel's hair. "You should be here," he whispered to the photo. "You should see our girl." New knocks on the door brought him back to reality. It was time. With the help of Andrew and Dr. Richard, John managed to stand up and walk to the door. Each step was a battle against pain and weakness, but he refused to show any sign of suffering. In the hallway, Isabel waited anxiously, practically jumping with excitement. When she saw her father, her eyes lit up with that pure and unconditional love that only children possess. "Daddy!" she exclaimed, running towards him. For a terrible moment, Andrew feared that the impact of the hug would knock John over. But from somewhere deep within, he found the strength to stand firm and embrace his little princess. "You look beautiful, my love," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "The most beautiful princess that ever existed." "It's because I'm wearing Mom's crown," she replied, touching the tiara reverently. "Now she can see us from heaven, right?" John swallowed the lump that had formed in his throat. "She can, Princess. She's always watching over us, always protecting us." From the garden came the first chords of the music that signaled the beginning of the ceremony. The guests must already be in their places, waiting. "Ready?" John asked, offering his arm to his daughter. Isabel nodded solemnly, a serious and adorable expression on her little face. As they prepared to go downstairs, Dr. Richard approached one last time to check John's vital signs. "At the first sign of weakness," he began. "I won't falter," John cut in. "Not today, not at this moment." And with those words, father and daughter began their descent to the garden, where the dream of a last happy memory was about to become reality. The garden was filled with guests when John and Isabel began their walk down the aisle of white petals. The soft music filled the afternoon air, mixing with the scent of the flowers and the golden glow of the sun filtering through the trees. It was a scene straight out of a fairy tale, but the looks on the faces of those present revealed a complex mix of emotions. Some guests whispered among themselves, still skeptical about the nature of the ceremony. Others, who knew the truth about John's health, struggled to contain their tears as they saw his superhuman effort to stand firm beside his daughter. Each step was a silent battle. The effect of the medication masked the worst of the pain, but John could feel his strength gradually ebbing away. Still, he maintained a serene smile on his face, focusing all his energy on not showing any sign of weakness that might worry Isabel. "Look at all the flowers, Daddy," she whispered, her eyes shining with enchantment. "It looks like magic." "You're the magic, Princess," he replied, squeezing the small hand that held his arm lightly. At the makeshift altar, under the great oak tree, Luke waited in his little suit, looking both proud and nervous about his important role in the ceremony. Andrew stood beside him, alternating worried glances between his son and the friend who was slowly approaching. Dr. Richard, discreetly positioned among the guests, monitored John's every movement with clinical eyes. The ambulance was strategically hidden behind the house, its paramedics on constant alert. When they finally reached the altar, John needed all his willpower not to show how exhausted that short walk had made him. His legs were trembling, and drops of cold sweat trickled down his back, but his smile remained unwavering. "Dear friends and family," began the officiant, an old family friend who had been carefully instructed about the true nature of the ceremony. "We are gathered here today to celebrate a very special moment." As the officiant spoke about love, family, and precious moments, John allowed himself to observe every detail of his daughter's face. The way her eyes sparkled with happiness, the little wrinkle that formed between her eyebrows when she concentrated on something, the smile that was so like Clara's. Every expression, every gesture was engraved in his memory like a precious treasure. Luke, in his role as groom, approached timidly when it was his turn to participate. He held a small pillow with 2 chocolate rings, an idea that had delighted the children during the preparations. "Now," said the officiant, bending down to be at the children's height, "you will exchange these special rings as a symbol of the friendship you share." The children performed the exchange with a comical seriousness, eliciting emotional smiles from those present. Luke, red as a tomato, managed to put the chocolate ring on Isabel's finger without dropping it, a feat he had practiced for days. "Daddy," Isabel called suddenly, turning to John with her big expressive eyes, "do you get a ring too?" For a moment, the innocent question almost broke his composure. Swallowing the lump that had formed in his throat, he knelt down with difficulty to be at her height. "I don't need a ring, princess," he replied softly. "I have your love here, kept in my heart." It was at that moment that his legs finally gave way. Andrew, who hadn't taken his eyes off his friend, quickly stepped forward to support him, making it look like it was part of the scene. Dr. Richard took a step forward, but John stopped him with a look. "I'm okay," he murmured, only for Andrew to hear. "I just need a minute." Fortunately, Isabel was distracted by Luke, who had begun to tell a funny story about how he had almost swallowed one of the chocolate rings during rehearsals. The children's laughter gave John the precious seconds he needed to catch his breath. The officiant, realizing the situation, began to talk about the importance of friendship and family love, buying more time. Mrs. Mercedes discreetly approached with a glass of water, which John drank in small sips. "Want to stop?" whispered Andrew, still supporting part of his friend's weight. "No," John replied firmly. "I haven't danced with my princess yet." As if she had heard his words, the orchestra began to play the first notes of the music that had been specially chosen for this moment. It was a soft version of an old lullaby that Clara used to sing to Isabel. "Dance time," announced the officiant, smiling gently. Isabel's eyes lit up. She had rehearsed for weeks, learning the steps with Mrs. Mercedes, wanting everything to be perfect. John took a deep breath, gathering his last strength. With Andrew's discreet help, he managed to stand up. The world spun for a moment, but he stood firm. "May I have this dance, princess?" he asked, extending his hand to his daughter. Isabel accepted with a radiant smile, placing her small hand in his. Together, they moved to the center of the space that had been prepared for the dance. The soft music enveloped the atmosphere as father and daughter began to dance. Isabel, in her princess dress, twirled gracefully, her laughter mixing with the musical notes. John, even feeling every muscle in his body protest, kept the smile on his face, saving every second of that moment in his heart. The guests watched in reverent silence, many of them now truly understanding the meaning of that ceremony. It wasn't an eccentric whim of a millionaire father, as some had thought. It was an act of pure love, the last dance of a father with his daughter, a magical moment stolen from time that was running out quickly. "Daddy," Isabel called during one of the twirls, "are you crying?" John hadn't realized the tears that were streaming down his face. "They're tears of happiness, my love," he replied, his voice trembling slightly. "Because you're the most beautiful princess that ever existed." The music continued, and with it the precious dance between father and daughter. Each step was a victory against the pain, each smile a battle against the weakness that threatened to overwhelm him. But John refused to stop. This was the moment he had fought for, the final gift he wanted to leave for his little Isabel. The music was coming to an end, but John refused to let that moment end. Each second was precious. Each smile of Isabel's was a treasure he wanted to keep forever. However, his body was beginning to give clear signs that it wouldn't last much longer. "One more time, Daddy?" Isabel asked when the last notes began to fade. "Please, just one more song." John's heart clenched as he saw the sparkle of happiness in his daughter's eyes. How could he deny her anything at this moment? With an almost imperceptible nod to the orchestra, the music began again. Dr. Richard, who was watching everything closely, took a step forward, clearly concerned. Andrew stopped him with a subtle gesture. He knew his friend well enough to know that nothing would stop him from giving his daughter a few more minutes of magic. "Look, Daddy," exclaimed Isabel during a particularly graceful twirl. "I'm dancing, just like a real princess." "You are a real princess," he replied, his voice little more than a whisper. "The most beautiful of all." The effort to stay on his feet was getting harder and harder. Drops of sweat dripped down his face, and his vision began to blur at the edges. But the smile never left his lips, even when a particularly sharp pang of pain hit him. Mrs. Mercedes, noticing the signs of John's exhaustion, discreetly approached with Luke. "Isabel, dear," she called gently, "how about dancing a little with Luke? He's practiced so much." The boy, understanding his role even without fully grasping the situation, shyly extended his hand to his friend. "May I have this dance, Princess?" Isabel looked at her dad, as if asking for permission. John nodded, praying she wouldn't notice how his hands trembled. "I'm going to rest a little, Princess," he said, forcing a smile. "I'll dance more with you later." As soon as Isabel walked away with Luke, Andrew and Dr. Richard quickly supported John, practically carrying him to a chair strategically positioned under one of the trees. "That's enough," the doctor declared in a low but firm voice while checking his vitals. "You've already pushed yourself too far." "Not yet," John protested, though his voice barely rose above a whisper. "I still have to make my speech." "Absolutely not," Dr. Richard cut him off. "Your blood pressure is dangerously low, and—" "Please," John pleaded, his eyes fixed on Isabel, who was twirling happily with Luke. "It's the last thing I need to do. The last thing—" He couldn't finish the sentence. A violent coughing fit seized him, and this time it was impossible to hide it from the guests. Several worried looks turned in his direction. "The ambulance is ready," Dr. Richard murmured. "We can—" "No," John cut him off with a force that surprised everyone. "Not in front of her. I won't ruin this moment." As if sensing that something was wrong, Isabel stopped dancing and looked towards her father. John immediately straightened up in the chair, forcing a smile. "I'm fine," he said, more to himself than to the others. "I just need—" Before he could finish, Isabel came running towards him, dragging Luke by the hand. "Daddy! Daddy!" Luke had an amazing idea. "Can we release the butterflies now?" The butterflies had been a last-minute suggestion. A specialized company had provided dozens of white butterflies to be released during the ceremony. It was a detail that John had kept as a special surprise. "Of course, Princess," he managed to answer. "Uncle Andrew, can you—" But Andrew was already in motion, coordinating with the staff to bring the special boxes where the butterflies were. "All the guests can participate," he announced, his strong voice masking the emotion. "Everyone will receive a butterfly to release." The distribution of the small boxes created a welcome distraction, giving John a few precious moments to regain some strength. Dr. Richard took the opportunity to administer another dose of medication discreetly. "This will help with the pain," he explained. "But it's the last dose I can give. Your body can't take any more." John just nodded, his eyes never leaving Isabel. She was radiant, explaining to Luke and some other children how the butterflies symbolized freedom and love. "She's so much like Clara," he murmured to Andrew, who had returned to his side. "The same sweetness, the same ability to see beauty in everything, and the same strength as you," Andrew completed, helping his friend to his feet. "Are you sure you want to do this?" "Absolutely." With help, John managed to stand. His whole body was trembling with the effort, but his voice remained firm when he called the guests to attention. "Dear friends," he began, each word costing an immense effort, "I want to thank you all for being here at this very special moment." Isabel ran to his side, hugging his waist. Her weight, normally so light, almost knocked him over, but Andrew, always attentive, kept him steady. "Today is not just a party," he continued, stroking his daughter's hair. "It's a celebration of love, of a father's love for his daughter, of a love that transcends time and space." His voice faltered for a moment. He took a deep breath, ignoring the sharp pain in his chest. "When my beloved Clara left us," he continued, feeling Isabel tighten her hug, "I thought I would never know true happiness again. But I was wrong, because she left me the greatest gift anyone could receive." Silent tears ran down the faces of several guests. Even those who had come skeptical were beginning to understand the true dimension of that moment. "Isabel," he called, kneeling with difficulty to be at her level, "you are the greatest miracle of my life. Every smile of yours, every hug, every moment together is a treasure I will keep forever in my heart." "I love you, Daddy," she replied, throwing her arms around his neck. It was at that moment that the first butterfly was released. Soon, dozens of them filled the air, their white wings shining against the blue afternoon sky. Isabel let out a cry of joy, running to follow their flight with Luke and the other children. John watched the scene, as if he wanted to engrave every detail in his soul. Isabel's blue dress fluttered as she ran, her laughter mingling with the sound of the soft music, the butterflies dancing around her like tiny living stars. "It was worth it," he whispered to Andrew, who was supporting him. "Every second of pain was worth it to see that smile." And then, as if his body finally understood that his mission was accomplished, his legs gave way completely. It all happened so fast. Andrew managed to hold John before he fell completely, while Dr. Richard was already discreetly signaling to the medical team that was waiting. In a matter of seconds, several guests positioned themselves strategically, forming a human barrier to block the children's view. Mrs. Mercedes, who seemed to have developed a sixth sense for critical situations, quickly approached Isabel and Luke, who was still chasing the butterflies. "Come on, darlings," she called with forced enthusiasm. "Let's go to the treehouse and see the butterflies from up there. I bet the view is even prettier." Isabel hesitated for a moment, searching for her dad with her eyes. "But Daddy—" "Your dad is talking to some important guests," Andrew interjected, keeping his voice steady despite the panic he felt. "He asked you to go have fun with Luke." The little girl still seemed uncertain, but Luke, instinctively realizing that he needed to help, took her hand. "Come on, Isabel, I want to show you the surprise I left up there." There was no surprise in the treehouse, of course, but Isabel's natural curiosity won out. While the children walked away with Mrs. Mercedes, the medical team already surrounded John, who was semi-conscious. "Critical blood pressure," murmured one of the paramedics. "We need to get him to the hospital immediately." "No sirens," John managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. "Isabel can't—" "No sirens," confirmed Dr. Richard, taking command of the situation. "But we need to go now." The guests, now understanding the gravity of the situation, began to disperse discreetly. Some were crying silently, others offering help in hushed tones. The party that had begun like a fairy tale now had a heavy air of farewell. "Andrew!" John called as he was placed on the stretcher. "Take care of her. Don't let her—" Another coughing fit prevented him from continuing. The handkerchief, the Dr. Richard pressed against his lips, turned red with blood. "You will take care of her personally," Andrew replied, holding his friend's hand. "You're going to be okay, and—" "Enough with the lies," John cut him off, his voice weak but resolute. "We both know that my time—" "We need to go," Dr. Richard interrupted. "Now!" As the ambulance quietly left through the back of the property, Andrew remained in the garden, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. How would he explain all this to Isabel? How would he protect that innocent child from the pain that was to come? From the top of the treehouse came the laughter of the children. Mrs. Mercedes had managed to distract them with an elaborate story about how the butterflies chose where to land. Isabel's voice sounded happy and carefree, completely unaware of the drama that was unfolding. "Mr. Bloomfield," called one of the waiters timidly. "What do we do with the party?" The party. Andrew looked around, at the flowers that now seemed sadly ironic, at the lights that were beginning to glow in the twilight, at the cake that would not be cut. "Keep everything as it is," he decided, "at least until the children—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The reality of what was happening hit him with full force. His best friend was fighting for his life in an ambulance, and he was here, trying to maintain a facade of normalcy to protect a 6-year-old girl. "Uncle Andrew!" Isabel's voice brought him back to the present. She came down from the treehouse, still in her princess dress, now slightly wrinkled. "Where's Daddy? I want to show him the butterflies that landed up there." Andrew swallowed the lump that formed in his throat. "Your dad had to take care of something very important, Princess, but he'll be back soon. But it's our special ceremony," she protested, a small pout forming on her lips. "He promised he would stay with me the whole time." Luke, who had come down right behind her, sensed the tension in the air. Even at his young age, the boy seemed to understand that something was wrong. "Hey, Isabel," he called. "Let's play hide and seek with more butterflies. I think I saw some near the roses." Once again, the distraction worked. Soon the two children were running through the garden, their laughter echoing in the night that was beginning to fall. Andrew watched, feeling his heart break a little more with each sound of joy that he knew was temporary. His phone vibrated. It was a message from Dr. Richard. "Critical condition, ICU. Come as soon as you can." "Mercedes," he called, his voice betraying the contained emotion. "I need you to stay with the children. Go," she replied simply, understanding without needing further explanation. "I'll take care of everything here." Before leaving, Andrew looked once more at Isabel. She had found a white butterfly perched on a rose and was explaining animatedly to Luke how butterflies chose the most beautiful flowers. Just like her mother, he thought, remembering how Clara always found beauty in the little things. God, help us keep her that way for a little longer. At the hospital, the scene he encountered was even worse than he imagined. John was connected to various machines, tubes and monitors, occupying every available space around his fragile body. But even in that state, even with the oxygen mask covering half of his face, his first words were about Isabel. How is she?" he asked with difficulty. "Happy," Andrew replied, holding his friend's hand. "Looking for butterflies in the garden with Luke." A small smile appeared on John's lips. She liked the party?" "It was perfect," Andrew assured him, fighting back tears. "You gave her memories she will cherish forever." "Good," John murmured, his eyes beginning to droop. "That's good." Dr. Richard entered the room at that moment, carrying a clipboard with exams. His expression said everything that his words would try to soften. "Andrew," John called before the doctor could speak, "promise Promise you'll tell her everything someday. Explain why the party. I promise, Andrew replied, his voice choked. But you yourself will be able to... No, John cut him off, gathering strength for a last show of lucidity. We both know I won't. Just promise me you'll take care of her. That you'll make sure she never forgets how loved she was. Tears now ran freely down Andrew's face. I promise, my friend. I promise on everything that is sacred. John nodded slightly, seeming finally to allow himself to relax. His eyes began to close, the exhaustion of months of struggle finally overcoming him. Clara, he murmured, so low that Andrew could barely hear, take care of our little girl. The days that followed the party were a delicate exercise in balancing truths and half-truths. Isabel woke up every morning asking for her dad, and each explanation about his absence weighed more heavily than the last on the hearts of the adults who surrounded her. Is Daddy still on his business trip? She asked that morning as Mrs. Mercedes helped her get dressed for school. The housekeeper exchanged a quick glance with Andrew, who had slept at the Torres mansion once again to help with the children. Luke was also spending a lot of time there, a constant presence that helped to distract Isabel. Your dad is taking care of very important things, Mercedes replied, choosing her words carefully. But he thinks about you all the time. He didn't even call me after the ceremony, Isabel commented, a small pout forming on her lips. Maybe he didn't like it. Andrew felt his heart clench. In the hospital, John was fighting for his life, connected to dozens of machines, and his daughter thought he might be angry with her. The ceremony was perfect, Princess, he assured her, approaching to help with the school backpack. Your dad was very, very happy. He told me that. Isabel's eyes lit up. You talked to him? When can I talk too? The momentary panic in Andrew's eyes was saved by Luke, who ran into the room. Isabel, come see. One of the butterflies from the ceremony is still in the garden. The little girl immediately forgot her questions, running with her friend to see the butterfly. The adults were left behind, the weight of the secret they carried becoming increasingly difficult to bear. We can't keep lying like this, said Mercedes, her voice trembling. She needs to know. Not yet, Andrew cut her off. John wouldn't want her to know, not while... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The two knew that John's condition was worsening every day. Dr. Richard had been clear it was a matter of time. At the hospital, visits were limited and discreet. No one could know where John was. The press was still trying to find the whereabouts of the businessman who had disappeared after the controversial party. The pain medication is no longer working, explained Dr. Richard during the visit that morning. We are doing everything possible to keep him comfortable, but does he still ask about her? Asked Andrew, watching his friend who slept a restless sleep. Always. In moments of lucidity, that's all he talks about. At the Torres mansion, life tried to follow a seemingly normal routine. Isabel went to school, did her homework, played with Luke, but the adults noticed small changes in her behavior. She had started saving scraps of paper with drawings and messages for when Daddy comes back. She spent a lot of time in his office, just sitting in the large leather armchair, hugging the stuffed bunny that Clara had given her. Uncle Andrew, she called one afternoon while he was helping her with her homework. Why doesn't Daddy call? He always called when he traveled before. Andrew felt as if someone had squeezed his heart with an icy hand. Sometimes, Princess, when adults are very busy, but he promised, she interrupted, her eyes filling with tears. He promised he would always be there for me. Luke, who was playing nearby, dropped his toys and approached his friend. Without saying anything, he just took her hand and squeezed it lightly. It was such a simple gesture, but so full of understanding that it made Andrew swallow hard. Your dad loves you more than anything in the world, he managed to say finally. Never doubt that. That night, after the children went to sleep, Andrew, received an urgent call from the hospital. John's condition had worsened considerably. "He's calling for you," Dr. Richard informed him. I think it's time to prepare yourself." The drive to the hospital was a blur in Andrew's memory. He found his friend awake, but visibly weaker than ever. The oxygen mask could no longer disguise his difficulty breathing. "Andrew," he called with effort when he saw him enter. I need you to promise." "Don't," Andrew cut him off, holding his hand. "Don't talk as if it's a goodbye." "Please," John insisted, each word costing a visible effort. "I need to know she'll be okay." Andrew sat down on the chair next to the bed, still holding his friend's hand. "You know I'll take care of her as if she were my own daughter. We all will." "The envelope," John continued. "The one I gave you when she's older. She'll get it," Andrew promised. "When the time is right, I'll deliver it and explain everything." A small smile appeared on John's lips. Does she ask about me?" "Every day," Andrew replied, unable to hold back the tears. "She saves drawings for you, writes little letters." "My princess," John murmured, his own eyes filling with tears. "My greatest treasure." The monitors began to beep more intensely. Dr. Richard ran into the room, followed by nurses. "Andrew," John called urgently, Tell her that was the happiest day of my life, that every dance, every smile." His voice failed, interrupted by a violent coughing fit. The nurses began to move quickly around the bed, adjusting equipment and medications. I need to see her," he managed to say between gasps. "Just one more time." "It's not possible," Dr. Richard firmly interjected. "Your condition is too serious." "Please," John pleaded, his eyes fixed on Andrew. Just a moment." Andrew looked at the doctor, who shook his head negatively. The risk was too great. How would they explain it to Isabel if something happened in front of her? "She's sleeping now," he said softly, "dreaming of butterflies and princesses, I'm sure." John seemed to calm down a little with those words. "Butterflies," he repeated with a weak smile. "She was so happy." The monitors continued their insistent warning. Dr. Richard gestured, indicating that Andrew needed to leave. "I'll come back tomorrow," he promised, squeezing his friend's hand one last time. "Take care of her," John murmured, his strength clearly failing. "Make her smile always." Those were his last conscious words before plunging into a restless sleep. Andrew left the room feeling as if he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall and finally allowed the tears to fall freely. How would he tell Isabel? How would he explain to a 6-year-old that her father, her hero, her Prince Charming was... The early hours of the morning at the hospital were a succession of critical moments. The doctors and nurses constantly took turns in John's room, whose condition seemed to worsen with each passing hour. Dr. Richard did not leave the hospital, personally monitoring every change in his patient's vital signs. Andrew also remained, unable to leave his friend alone at that moment. Every hour he called Mrs. Mercedes to find out how Isabel was. The girl had fallen asleep hugging the party dress, which she insisted on keeping hung next to her bed as a precious memory of the magical day with her father. Around 3 in the morning, something unexpected happened. John, who had been unconscious for hours, opened his eyes suddenly. "Clara," he called, his voice surprisingly clear. "Clara, you came..." Andrew and Dr. Richard and Andrew exchanged worried glances. Delirium was a common sign in terminally ill patients, but there was something different in John's expression. His eyes, previously clouded by pain and medication, seemed strangely lucid. "No," he continued, as if talking to someone only he could see. "I can't yet. Isabel, our little girl." The machines began to register significant changes in his vital signs. Dr. Richard quickly checked the monitors, his expression changing from concern to astonishment. "That's impossible," he murmured, checking the data again. "His blood pressure is stabilizing." Andrew approached the bed, watching his friend with a mixture of hope and fear. John continued his silent dialogue. "With Clara or with whomever he was seeing. Please," he whispered, "just a little longer. I need to see her grow up." The minutes that followed seemed eternal. Dr. Richard called other doctors, who analyzed exams and discussed in hushed tones in the hallway. Andrew remained by the bed, holding his friend's hand, feeling something different in the air, as if time itself had paused to make a decision. At the Torres mansion, Isabel woke up suddenly, startling Mrs. Mercedes, who was dozing in an armchair next to her bed. "What is it, dear?" the housekeeper asked, immediately alert. "Mom," Isabel replied simply, "she was here. She said Daddy's going to be okay." Mercedes felt a chill run down her spine. Before she could respond, the phone rang. It was Andrew, his voice trembling with emotion. "Something happened. Something I can't explain," he said. "The doctors are saying it's a miracle." Back at the hospital, the medical team worked frantically, performing new tests and adjusting medications. The results that came in seemed to defy all medical logic. "The metastasis," explained Dr. Richard, still incredulous, "is regressing. It's as if his organism has found forces to fight that didn't exist before." John had fallen into a deep and peaceful sleep, very different from the restless unconsciousness of recent weeks. His breathing, previously labored, was now more regular, and his expression showed a peace that had not been seen on his face for a long time. The following hours were of caution and waiting. No one dared make predictions or create hasty hopes, but it was impossible to ignore the positive changes that accumulated with each new exam. When the sun began to rise, Isabel woke up again. This time she was smiling. "Mrs. Mercedes," she called, "can I put on my princess dress again? I want to be pretty when Daddy comes back." The housekeeper felt tears in her eyes. How? "Do you know he's coming back, dear?" "Mom told me," she replied with the unwavering certainty that only children possess. "She said he promised to stay, so he'll stay." At the hospital, John finally opened his eyes. His gaze was clear and conscious, very different from the confusion of recent days. "Andrew," he called, his voice still weak but firm. "I'm here," the friend replied, approaching quickly. "How are you feeling?" "Alive," John replied with a small smile. "More alive than I've felt in months." Dr. Richard entered the room at that moment, carrying a new battery of tests. His normally serious expression was lighter, almost hopeful. "I'm not going to lie," he said, after examining John carefully. "I still don't fully understand what's happening, but all indicators are improving in a way I've never seen in my entire career." "Clara," John murmured, more to himself than to the others. "She said it wasn't time yet, that our little girl needed her father." Andrew felt a chill run down his spine when he remembered Isabel's words about having seen her mother. "Could it be that I need to see my daughter?" John declared, trying to sit up. "Not yet," Dr. Richard firmly interjected. "We need to make sure this improvement is stable. A few more days of observation and then—" "No," John cut him off. "I've been away from her for too long. I need to—" "She's fine," Andrew assured him, gently pushing his friend back against the pillows. "In fact, she's more than fine." "You know what she said this morning? That she knew you were coming back because Clara promised." John was silent for a moment, his eyes filling with tears. "Then it wasn't just a dream," he murmured. "Clara really was here." The following days were of constant and progressive recovery. The doctors continued to marvel at the speed with which John responded to treatments, as if his body had found an unknown source of strength and vitality. A week after what everyone called the night of the miracle, Dr. Richard finally gave John the authorization he had been waiting for. He could receive a visit from Isabel, but we need to prepare her, Andrew warned. She can't see all that equipment, all those machines. We've already taken care of that, Dr. Richard replied. We prepared a special room, more welcoming. He's strong enough to be transferred there during the visit. While the preparations were being made at the Torres mansion, Mrs. Mercedes helped Isabel get dressed. The girl had insisted on wearing the party dress again. "Do you think Daddy will like it?" she asked, spinning in front of the mirror. Mercedes swallowed the lump in her throat. "He'll love it, honey. I'm sure he'll love it." Luke, who was also present, watched everything with his serious and understanding eyes. "Can I go too?" he asked shyly. "Later," promised Andrew, who had arrived to pick up Isabel. "First it has to be just her and her dad." The way to the hospital was full of anticipation. Isabel didn't stop talking, asking 1,000 questions about where her father was, why he had been gone for so long, if he had missed her. Andrew answered carefully, gently preparing her for what she would see. "Your dad is a little weak," he explained. "That's why we need to be caring and gentle." When they finally arrived at the door of the special room, Isabel stopped for a moment, suddenly serious. "Uncle Andrew," she called softly, "Daddy's going to be okay now, isn't he? Mom promised." Andrew knelt down to be at her level, adjusting a rebellious curl of her hair. "You know what, Princess? I don't think your mother ever broke a promise." And with those words, he opened the door to the room where John was waiting, anxiously to meet his little princess again. 15 years had passed since that day in the hospital. The reunion between father and daughter had been just the beginning of an extraordinary journey of recovery and rebirth. Against all medical expectations, John not only survived, but recovered completely. Doctors were never able to scientifically explain what happened that night when Clara visited both father and daughter, but for the family, no explanations were needed. Now, on a sunny spring morning, Isabel, a young woman of 21, was again in front of the mirror, adjusting a white dress. This time, however, it wasn't a symbolic ceremony. It was her real wedding. "Are you nervous?" asked Mrs. Mercedes, who, even after so many years, continued to be a constant and loving presence in the family's life. The housekeeper helped to adjust the veil, the same one that Clara had worn at her own wedding. "A little," admitted Isabel, her eyes sparkling with emotion. "But it's a good nervous." On the other side of the door, they could hear the movement of the guests arriving. The garden of the Torres mansion had again been transformed into a fairy tale setting, but this time for an even more special celebration. "May I come in?" John's voice sounded from the door. When Isabel turned around, she saw her father standing there, healthy and strong, his hair now completely grey, being the only visible sign of the passage of time. "Dad!" she exclaimed, running to hug him as she did when she was a child. John hugged her tightly, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. "My princess," he murmured, "you're even more beautiful than your mother." Isabel stepped back a little to look into her father's eyes. "Are you okay? Aren't you feeling tired or—" "I'm great," he assured her with a smile. Even after so many years, she still worried about his health. "I've never been better." It was true. After that miraculous recovery, John had dedicated himself to living each moment fully. He accompanied every step of Isabel's growth, every achievement, every special moment. And now he was there to take her to the altar. This time, for a real wedding. "I brought something for you," he said, taking a small box from his pocket. Inside was a delicate pearl necklace. "It was your mother's. She wore it at our wedding." As he helped his daughter put on the necklace, John couldn't help but think about how everything had changed since that first ceremony 15 years ago. What had begun as a desperate attempt to create a last happy memory for his daughter had turned into the beginning of a new story. "You know," he began, adjusting a strand of her hair. "That day, when I organized that first party, I was so scared. I wanted so much to give you something special to remember, something magical. And you did," she replied softly. "It was the most magical day of my life. Well, until today." A gentle knock on the door interrupted the conversation. It was Luke, already in his groom's suit, looking simultaneously nervous and radiant. "Can I talk to the bride for a minute?" he asked shyly. "No way," John joked, feigning seriousness. "It's bad luck for the groom to see the bride before the wedding." "Dad," Isabel protested, laughing, "since when are you superstitious?" "Since my only daughter is marrying my godson," he replied, but his smile betrayed his genuine happiness with the union. Luke and Isabel had grown up together, their childhood friendship blossoming naturally into love over the years. Andrew and John watched with joy as their relationship evolved, knowing that they couldn't wish for a better match for their children. "I just wanted to say," Luke began, still standing in the doorway, "that I'm wearing the same bow tie as that day. For good luck." Isabel felt her eyes fill with tears. "You kept it?" "Of course I kept it. It was the day I decided I was going to marry you." John and Mrs. Mercedes exchanged emotional glances. It was impossible not to see the true love that existed between the young couple. "That's enough," declared Mrs. Mercedes, discreetly wiping away a tear. "Everyone out. I need to make my last adjustments to the dress." As he walked down the hallway with Luke, John couldn't help but smile as he remembered how it had all started. "You know, son," he said, "that day, 15 years ago, when you participated in our little ceremony, I was saying goodbye. I didn't think I would live to see this moment." Luke stopped, turning to face his godfather. "Uncle John, can I tell you something? Something I've never told anyone, not even Isabel." "Of course." "That night after the ceremony, I also saw Aunt Clara," he revealed. "She was in the garden, among the butterflies. She smiled at me and said that I needed to take care of Isabel, because one day she would be my real princess." John felt a chill run down his spine. In 15 years, this was the first time he had heard someone other than Isabel mention seeing Clara that night. "Why didn't you ever say this before?" "I didn't think anyone would believe me," Luke replied simply. "But today seemed like the right time." In the garden, the guests were already in their places. Andrew, who would be the best man alongside, John, approached the two. "It's time," he announced, hugging his son. "Are you sure you don't want to change your mind? There's still time to run," he joked. "I've never been so sure of anything in my life," Luke replied with conviction. When the music began to play, all the guests stood up. Luke took his place at the altar, while John returned to fetch his daughter. On the way, he stopped for a moment. In the mansion's chapel, "Thank you, Clara," he whispered to the portrait of his wife that he always kept there. "Thank you for giving me more time with our little girl." The ceremony was even more emotional than everyone expected. When John led Isabel down the same petal-strewn path they had walked 15 years before, there wasn't a dry eye in the garden. The most touching moment, however, was during the exchange of vows. Luke, with tears in his eyes, surprised everyone by revealing that he had kept not only the bow tie, but also the chocolate ring from that first ceremony. "It's a little melted," he joked, showing the small box where he had kept it, "but it was my first promise of love to you. Today, I'm here to make that promise again, this time forever." Isabel moved, took something from the bouquet. It was the crumpled paper of the drawing she had made of the princess dress so many years ago. "And I kept my first dream of being your princess," she replied. "Today, that dream comes true." After the ceremony, during the party, John watched the newlyweds dancing their first waltz as husband and wife. Andrew approached, offering a glass of champagne to his friend, 15 years, he commented. Who would have thought? Sometimes I still wonder if all this is real, John admitted. If that night really happened, if Clara really... He was interrupted by a white butterfly that landed gently on his glass. It was identical to those that had been released at that first party. "Dad!" called Isabel, approaching with Luke. "Did you see? The butterflies are back." John smiled, watching more white butterflies appear in the garden, dancing in the air like little messengers of love and hope. "Your mother always loved butterflies," he commented softly. "She said they were symbols of transformation and rebirth." "Like you, Uncle John," said Luke, hugging Isabel. "Like all of us." That night, as the party continued, John allowed himself a moment alone in the garden. The stars shone brightly in the sky, and the gentle breeze carried the scent of the flowers. "You were right, Clara," he murmured to the night. There was so much still to live, so much love still to give and receive. A last white butterfly flew by, its wings shimmering under the moonlight, like a final sign that some miracles need no explanation. They simply happen when love is strong enough to transcend all barriers, even those of time and death. And so, the story that began with a farewell transformed into a new beginning, proving that love, in all its forms, is the greatest transformative force that exists.